LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is Next Big Idea Classics. Today, Adam Grant on why helping others drives success. For decades now, there's been growing evidence that nice people, people who are kind, generous, we might call them givers, are happier. They have stronger relationships. They even live longer. Sure, you may say, but are givers really cut out for the ruthless world we live in? Why do so many merciless takers rise to the top? I'm thinking of everyone from J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller to the young Steve Jobs and the more recent Elon Musk. In a dog-eat-dog world, are givers what's for dinner? 12 years ago, Adam Grant, who was already a legendary Wharton professor, he was tenured at 28, answered this question in a seminal book called Give and Take: Why Helping Others Drives Our Success. His research showed that, yes, givers often do land at the bottom, but they're also overrepresented at the very top of the success ladder. And what's more, changes in technology and culture are causing the advantage of being a giver to become stronger over time. On balance, if you want to get ahead, you're better off being a giver. This argument, made forcefully in Give and Take, was a huge paradigm shift. The book was widely cited and inspired countless business leaders to make meaningful changes to their cultures. It had an impact on me personally as well. It supported my growing conviction that generosity and ambition are not, in fact, at odds. They're bedfellows. And it was because of this book that I met Adam Grant, who went on to become one of our 4 curators here at the Next Big Idea Club, and who has demonstrated year after year his commitment to giving to our community. Following its publication, Give and Take quickly became a bestseller, and it's now considered a modern classic in psychology and leadership. It's earned a spot as the 4th in our series of Next Big Idea Classics, alongside Atomic Habits by James Clear, Radical Candor by Kim Scott, and Drive by Daniel Pink. 12 years later, it's a great pleasure to dive back into Adam's ideas, discuss what's changed since its publication, and explore how we can all find meaningful, sustainable ways to succeed by lifting each other up. I hope by the end of this conversation, Adam and I will have convinced you that the moral divide is not necessarily between selfless saints and conniving gluttons. It's between those who figured out how to live in a way that is generous, connected, and successful, and those who have not. Generosity is not always easy, mind you, but it is, very simply and on every level, a better way to live.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, host of Everyday Better, an award-winning podcast dedicated to personal development. Join me every week for captivating stories and research to find more fulfillment in your work and personal life. Listen to Everyday Better on the LinkedIn Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Adam Grant, welcome back to the Next Big Idea.
Always a delight, Rufus.
Adam, it's been 12 years since you published Give and Take, which was your first book. Can you believe that it's been 12 years?
Thanks for reminding me. No, I can't. It feels like 3 or 4 years ago.
Right. I know. Well, it's a book that had a big impact on me, and I think a huge impact on the world at large. And we have selected it, as you know, as the 4th book in our classic series. The first 3 were Atomic Habits, Radical Candor, and Drive by our friend Dan Pink. So it's just been such a privilege to get to reread it and dive in. I think it's as relevant as it was then.
Honored, and we'll see if you rethink that during this conversation.
So in Give and Take, you describe three ways that people interact with the world. They're givers, takers, and matchers. These terms have become, I think, common parlance in many sectors of the business world, I believe as a result of the influence of your book. For listeners who are new to the concept, what are these three reciprocity styles, as you call them, and what's kind of the broader thesis of the book?
Yeah, so the basic idea is that around the world, there are three styles of interaction that show up over and over again. Givers are people who constantly ask others, what can I do for you? Takers are the opposite. They want to know, what will you do for me? And matchers live in the middle and they say, hey, I'll do something for you if you do something for me. And I was curious about the success and failure rates of these three styles. And I was sad to see that givers were often the worst performers when I looked at data on engineers, salespeople, medical professionals. And a lot of people said, well, it's got to be the takers. And no, the takers tended to rise quickly, but they also fell quickly. Okay, well, then it must be the matchers. They're not too selfish. They're not too generous. But in fact, across multiple professions, the best performers, not just the worst performers, tended to be givers. And the book really takes on this paradox that helping others could sink your career, or it could accelerate it. And what do successful givers know that takers and matchers ought to learn, but also that failed givers need to learn?
You describe in the book that you asked this question of your students at Wharton. Which type of person do you think ends up at the bottom of the success ladder? And to them, it was just unanimously obvious. Like, of course, the givers are at the bottom. And they were kind of incredulous that they were also at the top, right? And you wrote the book partly to sort of make this case. Do you think that if you asked your class at Wharton today the same question, I mean, I guess probably a lot of your students have read the book, but do you think that the culture has moved? Do you think that it's easier to convince students now than it was 12 years ago?
I do. Yeah, I think that a lot of them have read at least parts of the book or watched the TED Talk. So I have a biased sample, but I don't think it's as hard to make the case now, in part because the narrative has changed. In part because I think we've watched a lot of takers fall. We've watched people who were relentlessly selfish lose their jobs. We've watched some of them go to jail. We've watched a few get away with it too, unfortunately. But I think as people realize that taking is in some cases a shortcut, but it doesn't frequently lead to lasting success. I think they've realized, all right, we've got to think about more sustainable options. I think we've also seen some givers come out of the woodwork and realize if we I think there was a problem when I wrote Give and Take that is less of an issue now, which is a lot of people looked up at successful people and they saw a lot of takers and they concluded, well, in order to be successful, you have to be a taker. What they overlooked was that among successful people, the takers are much more visible than the givers. The takers want the attention. They demand the credit, whereas the givers were very happy to help behind the scenes and avoid the spotlight. And I think we've seen, again, you can pick your favorites, but we've seen a lot of people make an effort to be more visibly generous, knowing that we need role models who are not hiding in the shadows.
One thing that's been really nice to see is that there's been an appetite in the business world to operationalize the ideas in Give and Take. And I think you've helped contribute to this by developing tools like the reciprocity ring and the knowledge sharing platform, GIVERS. And I think part of what these tools are aiming to accomplish is providing a structure for giving and perhaps making it more of a cultural norm and reducing the burden on any individual giver. Is that right? Do you see these efforts as making headway?
I hope so. I mean, I want to see the randomized controlled trials where we introduce these structures or we change the norms and then we see whether people are willing then to shift from taking or matching toward giving, or whether entire organizational cultures and reward systems actually start to evolve. But I do think, I think we have some good evidence on this one, and this comes from Wayne Baker. So Wayne and Cheryl Baker created the reciprocity ring initially, and for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a very simple exercise that can have very powerful effects, which is you gather a group of people, ideally people from different networks, And you ask them all to make a request for something they want or need, but can't get on their own. And then you challenge everyone in the room to try to use their knowledge and their connections to fulfill the requests. And in my experience, about 80% of the requests get meaningful help that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And it works in part because empirically, somewhere between 75 and 90% of all helping in organizations starts with a request. And once you know what other people need, you realize, well, I know something or someone that might be able to help with that. And a lot of us don't make the ask in the first place. We don't want to be vulnerable. We want to be self-reliant. We want to look competent. If you're a giver, there's another barrier. You don't want to be a burden to others. And so this exercise unlocks the willingness of people to ask, and in turn, it brings the givers out of the woodwork. Well, Wayne studied this with Nat Bulkley, and he was interested in what happens over time when you go into the reciprocity ring, you make a request, and then it could be a random stranger or somebody you've only met once from a different department of your company. They help you. What happens then? Well, it turns out the norm of generosity rises, and it rises as people start to seek and give help. And it rises at first, as a lot of people think, for reputational reasons. Like, imagine a taker being in a reciprocity ring. They're like, okay, if I don't sign up to help anybody, everyone's going to know I'm a taker, and I don't want to be outed. But then over time, those reputation benefits fade, and yet people keep helping. And what Wayne and Nat show in their data is they keep helping because they felt grateful that someone was willing to help them, and it wasn't immediately obvious how they could pay it back. And instead, they say, I'm going to pay it forward. And I think this is really one of the most powerful things that I've learned since I wrote Give and Take that I would have spent a lot more time on in the book if I had known it then, which is like a pay it back network, which is what matchers try to build, is inefficient. What are the odds that the same person I can help me back at the same time? And so this idea of like keeping track of like debt and credit in relationships doesn't make a lot of sense. What you want instead is a norm in a group or a team or a community or a family or a company where people say, I am willing to help anybody else in this group, and I expect that they are also willing to help me.
I also love the nuance that actually it turns out that the act of asking for help is a critical piece of the puzzle, and one that givers might not naturally be comfortable with, but we can learn and understand that actually because giving is gratifying and because furthering these norms, establishing these norms is so powerful, that actually asking for help is really, really important. And as Ben Franklin noted, I always love this, that actually like a great way to build relationships is to ask people for favors, ask people for help.
Yeah, because then when they help you, they ask themselves, like, why did I do this? I must like you. I must care about you. This was not intuitive to me at all when I wrote the book, but when I work with leaders on building cultures of giving rather than taking or matching, one of the first things I say is you have to increase the amount of help seeking that people do. And the easiest way to do that is to model it as a leader. And sometimes leaders push back and they're like, no, I want people to be offering help. Well, I've tried running the reciprocity ring where instead of writing on flip charts or, submitting into an app, like here's my request, people actually volunteer their contribution. And I say, hey, whatever you're willing to offer to anyone else in this group, put it out there. It doesn't work. It's a total flop because people have no idea what others need. And they end up offering things that they think are valuable, but are useless to everybody else.
There's no doubt that Give and Take has had a massive impact. I mean, just doing some exploring before this conversation, it just, a wonderful degree of there's an extraordinary quantity of references to the book and organizations that have been inspired by it and modified their policies. Like the startup accelerator Techstars has adopted Give First as their mantra, citing your book. There's been more and more talk about hiring, specifically with a focus on avoiding takers. Has there been, in the last 12 years, more in the way of hard evidence to suggest that more generous cultures outperform less generous ones?
Oh, such an interesting question. Well, I think this is another sort of lens that was missing from the book. Is I was heavily focused on the success and struggles of individual givers, takers, and matchers.
Right.
And I didn't think enough about groups and teams and organizational systems. There is now a wealth of evidence that if you can build values and norms around helping others, that actually benefits the performance of your whole team or your entire company. In particular, I would say look at the meta-analyses done by Philip Podzikoff and Nathan Podzikoff and others, where they show, first at the individual level, the amount of time that you spend helping others as a good organizational citizen contributes as much to your performance reviews and your promotions as how well you do your tasks in your job. But then they also show that organizations that have norms of people helping each other and solving each other's problems and sharing their knowledge freely and mentoring, if you think about all these giving behaviors adding up, you end up with a lot of people who are willing to do things that are not in their job description, but critical to collective success. You end up also with a lot of happy customers. Like, as a customer, you do not want to be served by a taker. And you're probably not thrilled to have a matcher who's, doing your taxes or cutting your hair.
Of course, Adam, it's easy I have to think the number of people who self-identify as givers or think of themselves as givers exceeds the numbers who are givers or whose behavior suggests that they're givers. I decided to test this, Adam, in my own marriage.
Uh-oh.
I asked...
Don't try this at home.
Yes, exactly. No, I'm doing it so you don't have to. I asked my very nearly perfect wife, Elisa, who you know, what percentage of the family work do you think that you do? Here was her answer.
What a fascinating question. I would say all in all, I take on 80 to 85% of the work in the home.
Uh-oh.
No. Adam, my own assessment is that I do about 45% of the work, and I'm not sure she's including my work dealing with family expenses, taxes, paying her parking tickets, jovially doing the dishes while listening to your excellent work-life podcast. So it seems that the two of us are highly productive. Apparently, we do 130% of the work of supporting our family together, or perhaps we have an inclination to exaggerate in our minds our own generosity. Where does the truth lie here?
Well, I think that someone is clearly lying, and it's most likely you. On average, men overestimate their contributions more than women do. I mean, you see this especially in the realm of housework. But I think the original research. So the classic study was done with married couples by Ross and Sickley, and then much more recently, Eugene Caruso and colleagues did the same exercise with work teams. And what happens is that for the most part, when people are trying to judge their contributions, they end up overestimating what they're adding relative to what other people think. And it sounds like an ego problem. And Rufus, I'm tempted to tell you that you're a little bit self-centered here. But it actually seems to be less about ego in the research and more about knowledge. You were there when you did the dishes. You were there when you did the taxes. You were not present in a lot of other situations where, not just your wife, but also other people were stepping up. And so it's easy to just be anchored too much on the things that you added and not be familiar with what your partner did. So I think you might want to calibrate there. So did you have the follow-up conversation about who's doing what?
Yeah. I've made my case, but no, I'm going to try to. I will say that I found for all listeners, I have found that listening to podcasts and audiobooks makes me a much more enthusiastic cleaner of the household. So I'm going to lead into that. You've clearly taken Elisa's side here, Adam, which I think is the right conclusion. But yes, I was hoping that the explanation was going to be more about a collective fallacy we all suffer from, the responsibility bias.
Yeah, no, I think I should say you should be careful if you're going to have the follow-up conversation with Elisa, because I don't actually know if this is true for couples, but in work teams, the way that you get rid of the responsibility bias and you lead people to accurately calibrate their contribution is you go around the team and you ask everyone what they've done. And then people realize, oh, actually, my colleagues have done more than I accounted for, and I probably need to adjust my estimate of my contribution. And that's great, except then each person in the team likes the team a little less because they don't feel as valuable as they felt before. And so
Interesting.
I'm just warning you that if you have this discussion with Elisa, you might come away thinking, I'm not as great of a husband as I thought I was.
Right. I think I might take the opposite approach and just say, honey, I think it's more like 90% that you do.
I can't condone that.
No, I'm gonna keep working on this. And I am pleased to learn that 3 out of 4 married couples take responsibility for more than 100% of the labor in their marriage. So we're not alone. Just let the record show. Of course, there are many types of human generosity, and people exhibit, I think, very different behaviors in different realms. There's a question of what we give to others and to whom and in what context. If we're all trying to become better givers here, how do you think about the different types of kindness that we can take part in?
So, Rufus, I failed to capture this well in the book, but after Give and Take came out, ended up doing a national survey of the different ways that people help others and found there are 5 or 6 ways of giving that people tend to gravitate toward. So common is sharing knowledge, mentoring others. There's providing emotional support.
Mm-hmm.
There is going the extra mile. And then there's, I think, the most overlooked form of generosity is actually making introductions, connecting people who could benefit from knowing each other but don't. And that idea of introducing people, I think, is one of my favorite ways of adding value as a giver, because it's very low cost to the person who's making the connection, but extremely high value to, if it's done well, to the people who are receiving it. And I think that it's interesting when I think about listening as a giving behavior, it can be the opposite in a lot of cases. It can be extremely time consuming. And it's not always clear if it's helpful to the other person. Although maybe if we were better listeners, it would be. But I think listening often falls in the emotional support category, or becomes a path to the mentoring category. And I think we all need to do some of that in our important relationships. But I would also encourage people who want to be generous without overextending and exhausting themselves to think about not just what is the benefit to others, but also what is the cost to me.
Yes, right. Because we have to be mindful of not burning out. I think many of us are givers in certain contexts, but not others. Maybe the most common example is being very generous in our personal lives, but less so in business environments, or even ruthless. You say towards the end of Give and Take, if we reserve giver values for our personal lives, what will we be missing in our professional lives? So it seems almost like part of your intention with Give and Take was specifically to convince people to expand their giver modality beyond the personal realm. Is that fair? And should we think of giving as kind of context specific for many people?
Peter Bellamy led research not too long ago showing that people are more likely to be at least matchers personally, but then a little more content to be takers professionally. Yeah. And I think you could probably assume something similar when it comes to generosity. It's obviously something that's expected of married couples, of parents, of friends. But do you have to be helpful to all your colleagues and customers all the time? No. I think for me, what's left out there is we spend the majority of our waking hours at work. And I think it would be a travesty if you think helping others is one of your core values in life, to just check those values at the office door. And I think when I wrote Give and Take, I was too narrowly focused on the workplace. I thought, as an organizational psychologist, I should write only about what I've personally studied and where my core expertise lies. And I think after Give and Take came out, I got so many questions about parenting and marriage. And I realized, I can read that research. Just because I'm a consumer of it, not a producer of it, doesn't mean I can't synthesize it and help people make sense of it. And I've applied it in my own marriage and in my own parenting. Helpful to communicate that to others too. But I do think it has relevance to the workplace, particularly because we spend so much time there. And because, frankly, there are too many taker cultures where it seems like you have to step on others to climb up the hierarchy. And in that kind of world, people actually get rewarded for being selfish and cutthroat. And I think as somebody who studies organizations for a living, it's my responsibility to prevent that from happening. I want the rising tide to lift all boats. I want to make sure that you define your career success as, do you make other people better? Not just, do you achieve great things yourself? And so, yeah, I think, it's an open question. Did Give and Take do any good on that front? And I will tell you, Rufus, I was surprised by something, which is, if you asked me, who was I speaking to primarily? It wasn't necessarily takers. It was people who thought you had to be a taker to get ahead.
Yes.
And I wanted to show them because the evidence was so clear that that was not the case.
Right.
And I think the feedback I've gotten has said there's a different group that I reached much more often and maybe more effectively, which was the group of failed givers who were burning out or getting burned by takers and didn't want to let go of their values of helping other people, but needed new habits to figure out, how do I show up as a giver without being a doormat? I've heard much more of that feedback than I have, this changed me from a taker to a giver, or we were able to shift our entire organizational culture from mostly taking and a little matching towards some matching and some giving. I think it's been the struggling givers who have responded the most, either the most frequently or the most powerfully to what I wrote in the book, which was not at all what I envisioned.
It seems to me that there is evidence that the norms are shifting and that Give and Take did make a big impact, given how often it's cited by company leaders and how much it's resonated in the last decade. I'm struck by how the norms diverge in different sectors of business. So, for instance, obviously, finance is famously cutthroat as here I am in southern Manhattan, surrounded by folks in finance. But it seems to me that we've seen movement in other areas of business, and I attribute that partly to the rise of tech companies that I think have become ever more prominent in our culture, that arguably have more collaborative cultures. What do you think?
I don't know. I think in general, industry effects are a little smaller than I expected. But I think all things equal, in general, you will find a disproportionate number of takers in an industry like finance because it's an industry that attracts takers. They gravitate toward a world in which they can accumulate lots of money and power, but also it often rewards that by only measuring people's individual returns. I have not met a lot of takers personally in social work. But where does tech fall, or where does science fall? I've actually found that organizational norms matter much more than industry norms. So if you have a founder of a tech company who's a huge taker, you don't see a lot of enthusiastic collaboration and helping in that organization. What you see is a lot of what Mike Johnson and colleagues have called cutthroat cooperation, where I pretend to help you and then I stab you in the back, or I badmouth you behind your back. I think if you have a founder or a CEO or senior leadership who really believes in servant leadership, then you end up with a much stronger culture of giving. And so I have worked with banks where there's a strong ethos of generosity. I have been sort of both surprised and disturbed by the number of nonprofit organizations that are almost like, they've almost built an ethos that they're Robin Hood. And they think it's okay to steal from the rich to give to the poor. And they're adopting practices that are, undermining their own employees and sometimes are not even serving their stakeholders well. I think we need to take a more nuanced look at what's the culture of this organization as opposed to just making assumptions based on industry alone.
Makes sense. Well, getting into some of the nuances in Give and Take about what givers and takers and matchers look like, I was fascinated by the section on powerless speech patterns, and the power. We might say the power of powerless speech patterns, which was as someone who currently is exhibiting just a little bit of a stutter, or I was delighted to read about. But so you give the examples that hesitations like, and hedges, kinda, sorta, probably, I think, and disclaimers. This might be a bad idea, but that these kinds of hesitant speech patterns actually lower people's resistance or listeners' resistance to new ideas, cause them to be more persuadable. I guess in some contexts, you might say. Meanwhile, this kind of stammering and equivocation is exactly what we were taught not to do growing up. How do you think about sort of the power of powerless speech?
Well, the reason I wanted to dig into that was I noticed a consistent pattern in the data, which is takers tended to speak in ways that commanded authority. They were very assertive. They wouldn't admit any uncertainty. They didn't necessarily want to express any doubts. They were trying to own the room. And I wondered, well, do givers talk differently? And the original paper that I was citing in that chapter by Alison Forgale had a big impact on my thinking. What she showed is that using some of those so-called powerless speech markers actually signals humility and concern for others, which are hallmark traits of a giver. Now, the open question is, do givers actually talk that way more? Or is this just an image that's created when someone talks that way? I don't think we fully know. But I think it's fair to say that if you are a giver, you're interested in other people's perspectives. And that means you're a little bit more likely to equivocate on, like, is my answer the right one? Or is my idea the best one? And I think you're right. We have been taught not to speak that way. We've been taught not to use weak language. Women in particular have been told for decades now that they need to scrub those kinds of speech markers altogether from their vocabulary because it gives away power. And yet, I actually wrote an op-ed about this in 2023 on how women's so-called weak language is a secret source of strength because the accumulating evidence shows that women actually benefit more from this kind of powerless speech than men do, unfairly, because women are stereotyped as modest and communal. And so they often get dinged when they use really assertive language. Whereas when they say, hey, here's an idea, but I'd love to get your take on it because I'm not sure about it, they're less likely to threaten, in particular, the men in the room. And Rufus, I think it's a travesty that this still exists. I think that in the 21st century, we should not be judging people on their gender at all. We never should have been doing it in the first place. But these stereotypes are still alive. And so I think that we should be really careful when we counsel women to speak only assertively because, unfortunately, that's often mistaken as speaking aggressively. I think, though, that this shouldn't be on women, right? What we should be doing is normalizing being the wisest person in the room, not the smartest, right? The smartest person in the room, that title often goes to the person who speaks the loudest and most forcefully. The wisest person in the room is the one who listens best and knows what they don't know and admits the things that they're not sure about. And I think, frankly, the onus is on men to model those behaviors and say, hey, when we don't know what we're doing, we have to put that on the table.
Yes, right. Yeah. And one example of a man who did this that you describe in the book is Abraham Lincoln. I was actually, and of course, the book Team of Rivals is a wonderful book. Describes, of course, Lincoln's incredible decision to hire his former competitors as members of his cabinet. But he was accused of being a waffler and an equivocator and all these things, right? And so it's nice to see that even in the realm of politics, it's possible to see deference to others and inclusion of others and a collaborative sensibility as an asset.
Well, it was once upon a time anyway.
It was once upon a time. Yeah, no, we live in a very different moment. This is something that fascinates me is the degree to which we have different expectations for behaviors potentially in different realms, in different contexts. And sometimes you say more declarative, assertive speech can be effective. You were involved in a study with some colleagues of, I think it was pizza parlors, right? And I think there's a case to be made that in contexts within which people are following, more direct, declarative communication is effective. Is that right?
Yeah, Dave Hoffman gathered these data, and it dawned on me when he was walking me through what he had collected that there was an opportunity to test a hypothesis that I'd been generating for a while, which was supported in our data. So the basic finding is that if you are an extroverted, assertive leader, you get the best results when you have a team that's passive or reactive. They're waiting for direction, and you bring out the best in them. But When we track store profits as a measure of pizza franchise success, it actually turned out that the quieter, more introverted leaders got better results when they had a proactive team who was bringing ideas and suggestions from below. And what seems to be the case is that the approach of command and control, when you have people who are ready to take the initiative and diagnose problems and come up with better solutions, actually crowded those out. Whereas the hey, I'd love to learn from you, I want to empower you, I want to implement your ideas approach, both means as a leader you get better ideas, but also you leave your team more motivated because they feel heard.
Another nuance to the quality of givers that I found fascinating, givers, you say, are less susceptible to the sunk cost fallacy. I did not expect this. You say, people actually make more accurate and creative decisions when they're choosing on behalf of others rather than themselves. Why is that?
I think about the sunk cost fallacy as part of a larger problem that Barry Staw first called escalation of commitment to a losing course of action, where you make an initial decision, it does not work out as you hoped, but instead of rethinking it, you double down and invest more time, more money, more energy. And
we've all done this. Yeah.
All of us, whether it's paying to replace parts on a used car when you should have just replaced the car, but I've already put so much money into it, whether it's waiting around at a restaurant for 45 minutes or an hour and not cutting your losses, whether it's, as my students sometimes tell me, staying in a bad relationship because you've already poured so much into this person. Yeah. Sunk costs are only part of the problem there. The biggest drivers empirically they're not economic. They tend to be emotional. Ego and image threats lead people to throw good money after bad. I don't want to look in the mirror and think I'm an idiot. And I don't want other people to look at me and think I'm a bad decision maker and question my judgment. And so I think, okay, I've got to just, persist and try to turn this ship around. Well, givers are less likely to do that than takers, according to some research that's been done on this, because givers are less likely to evaluate their past failures in terms of their own ego and image, right? The primary goal of a giver is not to look great or to boost their own self-esteem. It's to make the organization better and to boost the esteem of the people around them. And what that means is a giver is more likely, after failing, to say, I might have a little egg on my face, but pulling the plug now is going to serve my team, or it's going to help my colleagues, or it's going to benefit my organization. So I got to do it.
Makes sense. Right. So a giving modality is we're more likely to act in ways that are humble, which in turn are more rational when it comes to this kind of sunk cost situations. One section I found fascinating, Adam, that I think helps the geeks among us to understand the dynamics at play here with this distinction between givers and matchers and takers, and how these reciprocity styles affect people's trajectory over time, is the case of game theory. And what's so fascinating to me about game theory is we can actually test these different ways of interacting. Can you tell us a little bit about the tit-for-tat strategy and the generous tit-for-tat?
I think Martin Novak's work has been foundational here. He's an evolutionary biologist and mathematician who upended the way that a lot of people think about game theory. So the classic finding in game theory research was that tit for tat was the most effective strategy. When you have to choose, in a typical experiment, people have to choose between cooperating and competing. And the question was okay, in my lens, is it better to be a giver or a taker? And the answer was neither. It was better to be a matcher. If you cooperated with cooperative people and you competed with competitive people, that seemed like the best way to both protect yourself from the bad and also get the upside of the good.
Yeah.
Well, Novak comes along and says, wait a minute, a lot of these game theory experiments have been run without history, meaning you don't have repeated interactions with other players. And that means you don't have a relationship or a reputation.
Yeah.
What happens if we change that dynamic and we allow people to see the same other cooperators or competitors again? Well, in that version of the experiment, tit for tat is less effective than generous tit for tat. which is to say, if you cooperate, if you give, and they defect and take and screw you, 1 out of 3 times, instead of competing back, you should actually treat them kindly. And what that does is that incentivizes some of those people to reform. And it gives you the opportunity to say, okay, that person who acted like a taker in one situation, when I made a charitable interpretation of their behavior and I gave to them again, they actually reformed. And in that way, I'm not closing the door on the possibility that we could have a positive sum interaction as opposed to a zero-sum win-lose fight. And Rufus, I think this is important because these are stylized experiments. They're done in simulations, or sometimes they're done in very, very small trials with people. When I think about this in the context of real relationships, I think you have to be careful. If somebody has a history or a reputation of selfish behavior, you do not want to reward that. That's like going into the ocean and pouring a bunch of blood around a group of sharks. Right? It's like a flashing neon sign to takers saying, I am here for your exploitation. I think occasionally, though, someone's motives are ambiguous. And we don't know, is this person a taker? Did we misunderstand their intention? Did they end up in a situation where they felt like they were dealing with extreme scarcity and they had to take? And is there an opportunity to change that situation and bring out a better version of them? And I think that it's important not to overlook those. And I'll give you an example. I was studying a financial services company years ago, and a woman named Kathy got a big promotion. She was told that she was going to be co-leading a new team with a guy that I'll call Colin because it's his name. No, it's not his name. Not his name. But 4 different people went to Kathy and warned her, do not trust Colin. He's going to stab you in the back. He's going to steal credit for your ideas. Huge taker. Watch out. Kathy does something that few of us have the courage to do, Rufus. She sits down with Colin in their first one-on-one meeting, and she says, hey, Colin, I understand we're going to be leading this team together. I just wanted to let you know, this is what I've heard about you. She shares all the reputational feedback.
Wow.
Yeah, and Colin's response is priceless. He's like, I don't know who you've been talking to, but clearly all these people are jealous of me.
Oh, boy.
Thank you, Colin, for confirming that you're a taker.
Right.
Yep. Everyone is living in envy of you. But Kathy says, hey, you know what? Honestly, I don't know whether it's true or not. I don't know you.
Yeah.
But I hope it's not true because I do not work well with people who operate that way. And if this is who you are not going to like working with me. For the next year and a half, Colin changed his stripes. He volunteered for unpopular projects. He stopped dumping grunt work on others. He mentored junior people. He shared credit and went out of his way to acknowledge Kathy's work. And I think what Kathy did was she made his reputation visible to him. And then she gave him a clear incentive to earn a new one. And it was to me, a really good example of generous tit for tat because she knew that he had burned some other people in the past. She also had a hunch that there were conditions under which he would see that it was not in his own long-term self-interest to operate that way with her. But she set up some guardrails, and she was basically signaling to him, I am ready to go into matcher mode if that's how you want me to operate. Yeah. And it's your choice. And he chose, ultimately, the more generous path.
I'm fascinated by how reputation systems modify behavior. And what you just described about game theory and the movement from tit to tat to generous tit for tat when you introduce reputation is very powerful. And it seems that there's an argument that when we lived in small villages, reputation was all around us, and generous tit for tat would have been the better modality. But it seems that in the digital age, perhaps I like to think that the introduction of more reputation systems, this sense that, hey, your behavior will follow you, right, is hopefully having a positive impact on how people are behaving and rewarding givers ever more. Is that fair?
You could, I think, make that case. I think it's actually easier to make the argument that it's punishing takers more than they were punished in the past because somebody out there is waiting to cancel you for being a horrible person. Or at least that's the prevailing fear among a lot of people. But I also think there's a lot more you could do to design those kinds of systems. Imagine, for example, and I'm not suggesting we do this. This is an experiment where I would be curious about the effects. It's not a recommendation. Imagine if your LinkedIn profile included a rating from everyone who has ever collaborated with you. And it didn't show those individually, but you had 360 feedback from the whole universe of your colleagues. Would people be less selfish? Would we see fewer takers? I'd be willing to bet yes. I think there's some likely externalities of that I worry a lot about, like are people being rated fairly? But in general, I think as I think it was Justice Louis Brandeis one put it, like sunlight is a decent disinfectant. Hi, I'm Adam Grant, host of the podcast Rethinking, a show where I talk to some of today's greatest thinkers about the unconventional ways they see the world. On Rethinking, you'll get surprising insights from scientists, leaders, artists, and more. People like Reese Witherspoon, Malcolm Gladwell, and Yo-Yo Ma. Hear lessons to help you find success at work, build better relationships, and more. Find Rethinking wherever you get your podcasts.
Brace the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started today at linkedin.com/marketer. Terms and conditions apply.
Let's talk about how we can protect givers, or how givers can protect themselves. You've talked about the danger of being a doormat. And you yourself used to be a doormat, I think, in your early days working at
Big
Let's
time.
Go. How has your transformation, Adam, from a doormat to a non-doormat gone so far?
Well, I think I've recovered mostly. Every once in a while, my wife Allison still says to me, like, "Why are you helping that person? They only reach out when they want something, and like, here are all the ways that they've screwed you over in the past." But that's become a rarer and rarer piece of feedback. So I think I've made progress. We actually in this season of Work Life, we have an episode about how to say no. And it's particularly geared toward agreeable givers and people pleasers who struggle with boundary setting, but also thinking about how can organizations create norms where people have the freedom to say no. And I guess for me, two things have been really helpful. One has been finding effective strategies for saying no. And my favorite is just to say, like, "I'm sorry, I won't be available for this. Here's an article you might want to read," or "here's a person who might actually enjoy and benefit from offering whatever you're asking for." And the other has been to build systems to actually deal with these problems at scale. So actually, after Give and Take came out, one of the worst things that happened, Rufus, was our mutual friend, now mutual friend, at the time, journalist grilling me, Susan Dominus.
Yes.
Susan
I remember
wrote,
that cover story for the New York Times Magazine, right? That's right.
Exactly. She wrote this. I was hoping it would be, a review of Give and Take and, cover some of the key ideas and, really pressure test and challenge some of them. And she did a lot of that. But I think to make it more human interest, she made it a profile of me.
Yes.
And the irony of like this, so the New York Times Magazine runs this cover story. It's like my intellectual public offering, if that's a thing. I've been hiding in the ivory tower up until this point. The article comes out and the headline is Giving the Secret to Getting Ahead. And the whole article is about my research and how givers can rise. And Susan tries to look at some examples of, how things that I did to help other people actually contributed to my own success as a teacher and a researcher. And so my hope is that article comes out and people think, all right, like what are more 5-minute favors I could do for others? What are small ways that I could add large value to other people's lives? And I'm sure there was some of that, but what I saw immediately was every taker who read that article cold emailed me and asked for something. Like, wait a minute, I think you missed the point of the article. The point of the article was not like, let me reach out to someone who says he enjoys helping others and see if I can get him to do indentured servitude for me. It was, I should be doing more. But anyway, so you
managed to find a way to stress test your own philosophy of giving, right? By basically becoming famous as a giver.
The way that it happened was comical, but yeah, it was like over the period of a couple months, a few thousand emails. So it's not like every taker on earth came out of the woodwork, and it's also not like most people who read the article emailed me and asked for something. But one of the patterns across them was there were a lot of people who were asking for career advice. And I am the last person you should come to for career advice. One of the reasons I became an organizational psychologist is there were too many jobs I was interested in, and I couldn't pick one. So I thought, all right, I'm going to do the job where I get to study all of them, and I get to redesign my own job every week. So what I did then was, instead of having individual conversations with people, or instead of even inviting people to well, let's do a group FAQ session, I wrote up an FAQ on here are my favorite career resources. And then at the suggestion of a brilliant colleague, Reb Rebely, I created a triage role where all the incoming requests that weren't necessary or reasonable for me to deal with, Reb fielded. And then he would sometimes take a call. Sometimes he would provide the resource. But basically, I needed a support system, just like you would have in a hospital to triage all these random requests. And I've had a person working with me part-time ever since to do that. And it has been game-changing.
That's one way we can try to avoid burnout and still be givers. I've also read an interview in which you said that in the process of writing Give and Take, and perhaps in response to the success of it, you learn to be clearer about your priorities: family first, students second, colleagues third, everybody else fourth.
Yeah, I made that list just off the top of my head one day when somebody asked me, but who are you trying to help? And I was like, family, students, if there's time left over, colleagues, and maybe strangers. And the other thing I did was I prioritized how I wanted to help, not just who. So I said, look, career advice, not my thing. Maybe I'll help my students when I actually know them with career advice. But if you're a random stranger reaching out, I'm not good at helping you, and I'm not going to make that something I spend time on. So I paid a lot of attention to what were the forms of giving that I enjoyed doing the most, and where did I get the most consistent feedback? Not that I had been helpful, but that I made a unique contribution. I wanted to figure out where was my effort less replaceable and more distinctively valuable. And when I drew those two circles and looked at the Venn diagram where they overlapped, there were two forms of helping that I loved and got regular feedback that I was specifically helpful on. One was sharing knowledge, and the other was making introductions. And so I decided those are my go-to forms of giving. If somebody asks me, have you ever seen a study on, or what book should I read on, and it has anything to do with psychology or work, I'm thrilled to help, and it's very easy for me. And the other is, if I know you and I can help you open a door, it makes my day to do matchmaking. Not that successful when it comes to love, but when it comes to helping people find collaborators and friends and, someone to hire them for a job, if I think there's mutual benefit in making the connection, that brings me great joy. And it's something I've found I'm fairly good at. So I think the lesson here is we've all got to be clear on our priorities about who we're trying to help and how we're trying to help. And what that means is you get to say yes in ways that energize you and benefit others more. And that makes it easier to say no to everything else.
How can we identify takers?
There are at least three ways that you can identify takers. Number one is to look at how they talk about success and failure. Givers tend to take blame and give credit. Takers do the opposite. They're all about taking credit and throwing blame. Some of them might even try to build blame throwers, like in Spaceballs. So that's the first thing. It's not what they've achieved. It's whether they account for other people's contributions in their success, and then also take responsibility when they've blundered. Second thing you can do is to look at their beliefs about the world. There's good evidence that takers tend to rationalize selfish behavior. And so you don't want to ask them, what would you do? You want to ask them to predict what other people would do. I love doing this in hiring, for example. Like, what % of people do you think would hoard knowledge, or would steal credit for other people's ideas, or would dump grunt work on others? The people who are the biggest takers are the more likely to assume that everybody else is a taker.
Interesting.
Because they're informed by their own habits, which is why which is why I think that if you think you have to be like a selfish jerk to succeed, you might already be a selfish jerk. And then the last approach that I have found enormously useful is to look for patterns of kissing up and kicking down.
Yes.
Takers are great fakers when dealing with powerful people. They know you have to fake generosity to get ahead. But then they learn, gosh, it's a lot of work to pretend to care about everybody. And they tend to let their guard down with peers and subordinates who get to see their true colors, which means the more power and status you gain, the more compromised your judgment is of other people. And it's not that you're getting worse, it's that they're getting more motivated to impress you. And I think, in Hollywood, you learn who's a taker by looking at how actors treat makeup artists. I know years ago, Tony Hsieh told me at Zappos that he used to actually personally, when he was running Zappos, he would pick job candidates up from the airport and just pose as like their driver.
I love it. Yeah,
and
amazing.
Then he wanted to see how they treated somebody who they thought could do them no good.
To me, Adam, this mounting evidence in recent decades that giving and generosity drives happiness and health, it turns out, and success. This to me is just a sort of like wonderful truth, I think, about the nature of our interpersonal experience as humans. But of course, all this mounting evidence of the benefits of giving make the paradox of altruistic behavior more pronounced, right? Like if we know that giving is the best strategy, does this compromise the sincerity and authenticity of giving? Is it really giving if it's helping us, right? How do you see this?
The place I've landed on this is that it depends on what your primary motive is. So if you're helping others because you think it's going to help you get ahead, it's probably not going to work.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you're going to come across more like a matcher or a taker, which means, ironically, you don't get the relationship and reputation benefits of generosity. I think that if you do it because you enjoy being helpful and you care about the person you're helping, there's nothing wrong with being aware that in the long run, this is not something that's going to sabotage your ability to succeed. But I think your steering focus should be on your character, on how can I live by my principles of wanting to do as much as I can for others. And every once in a while, you should check your rearview mirror and ask, what kind of reputation am I building?
Now, you say this wonderfully in some of the last pages of Give and Take. You say, our behaviors leak traces of our motives, right? So if you're faking it, probably your behavior will leak traces of your motives. I also like.
By the way, Rufus, I just have to react to that, which is
please do. Yeah.
Not only does your behavior leak traces if you're not an Oscar-winning actor like most of us, but if you are that good of a faker, it probably is going to affect you. Because guess what? If you spend your days pretending to be a giver and other people buy into it, you become it. And they start to expect you to be generous. They ask more of you. And it becomes harder and harder then not to live up to those expectations. And so the joke may be on you.
Exactly. Whoops, I became a thoughtful and kind and generous person. Well, you also have a wonderful way of resolving this debate between philosophers and scientists studying human behavior about this question: does actual altruism exist? You quote the primatologist Franz de Waal, who says, the selfish-unselfish divide might be a red herring. Why try to extract the self from the other or the other from the self if merging of the two is the secret behind our cooperative nature? In other words, like, okay, if it turns out that actually we're helping ourselves as we help other people, well, that's as it should be. That's a better world we're living in.
Darwin understood this. When people say Darwinian, they're often describing a world where it's ruthless and cutthroat and takers are the ones who succeed.
Yeah.
But Darwin actually wrote that a tribe of altruistic people would outlast a tribe of selfish people because the altruists would put the tribe first, and that would ultimately lead to their success. And I think that, I think you're right. Fundamentally, it's a false dichotomy. Like, are people selfish or generous? Yes, we are fully capable of both. Yes. And when I call someone a giver, I'm not saying they're unconcerned about their own success and well-being. I'm saying they actually get joy out of helping others. And I think to be a successful giver, you have to figure out how to align your own goals with your values of helping other people. And that means not sacrificing yourself for others, but rather looking for ways to benefit others that are either low cost to you or also a benefit to you.
Yeah, no, and I think that this mounting evidence that more, giving, kind, generous behavior results in better health, better relationships, more career success. It makes it far easier to successfully spread these kinds of behaviors, right? Because I think the idea that altruism is some kind of rare, hallowed phenomenon has historically caused people to feel morally superior. I'm making all these sacrifices because I am, this sort of, rare altruistic person. You, on the other hand, are serving yourself and are beneath me. Whereas, in fact, I think the right communication is, come over here. It's much better over here. This, giving, kind, generous behaviors are going to benefit you in every possible way. It's a far more effective and contagious communication, right?
I think so too, and it makes me think about the framing of give and take and how I would write it differently today. I think I was so struck by the contrast between people thinking you had to be a taker to succeed and the evidence that I and many other social scientists had gathered that givers actually, in many fields, outperform takers in the long run. That I think I was too focused on making the case that generosity is the key to success. I think what I would say now is it's possible to succeed as a giver, taker, or a matcher. And sometimes one path will be faster and another path will be more sustainable. But at the end of the day, which one is best aligned with the person you want to be? Like, I don't have to convince you that giving is the best way to succeed. All I have to do is remind you that it's the most meaningful way to succeed. And if that's not enough, by all means, do not care about other people.
I've liked the idea, Adam, that I've had sort of a pet theory that there's a reframing one can do to define all success as group success. What do you think of this idea that all success is group success?
I think I wouldn't go quite that far because I think there are worlds in which success is zero sum. I think individual sports often feel that way, for example. But I think the broader observation is an important one, which is one of the areas of research that's flourished since Give and Take came out is on zero-sum mindsets and how a lot of people both don't give help and don't ask for it because they think we're pitted against each other. And, not surprisingly, leaders who tend to be narcissistic, dominant takers are more likely to instill that zero-sum mindset in their organizations. And I think what we need to do is we need to shatter that myth. Most success is not zero-sum. For the most part, making other people better does not sacrifice your own success. It elevates your success. And I think the more people understand that, the easier it is then for them to be generous with their knowledge and connections and also to invite others to help them too.
My last question is, what can we all do collectively to build a stronger, more effective culture of givers?
Well, actually, it's funny. I think we've touched on the three big ones in this conversation. I think number one, screen out takers. If you have knowledge, no matter how competent someone is, that they are willing to undermine others to try to get ahead, do not hire that person. Do not promote that person. That goes to the second point, which is you need a reward system that recognizes whether people are adding value to their colleagues, to their teams, to their customers, not just whether they're achieving their own individual objectives, so that people aren't disincentivized from giving. And then lastly, you need a culture where people can ask for help so that we can align what problems people are facing with the solutions that the most qualified givers have to offer.
I love it. Well, Adam Grant, thank you so much for being with us here today. What a pleasure to rethink Give and Take. Such a wonderful book and such a wonderful set of ideas.
Thank you, Rufus. As always, thoughtful and thought-provoking.
Give and Take is, of course, available wherever books are sold, as are Adam's other wonderful books, Originals, which features a cameo from yours truly, Think Again, and Hidden Potential. And as you probably know, Adam is one of our 4 curators here at the Next Big Idea Club, alongside Malcolm Gladwell, Daniel Pink, and Susan Cain. As a curator, he sometimes guest hosts this show. We've gathered all of his episodes in a handy-dandy Spotify playlist, which you can find in the show notes, along with a collection of all of our Next Big Idea classics. Have an idea for our next classic episode? Send us a note. We'd love to hear your suggestions. You can reach us at podcast@nextbigideaclub.com. I read every single email. Today's show was produced by the great Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Mike Toda. Our theme music was performed by Nathaniel Wolkstein. We love working with all the givers at the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.